So I'm really excited to introduce our guest today. I found him because reading an article about Steve Inskeep in the New York Times, I went through the comments section. Actually, I think it was an article about the comments section that they made a whole separate article. And I found our guest's comment, and I was really drawn to it and reached out to him, and he agreed to be on the podcast. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm introducing you to Mick Smyer. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Mick, we wanted to ask you, what is your adoption story? We know a little bit about you, but give us your background and start with why you're on this podcast.
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I started out life in a Catholic orphanage in New Orleans. My birth mother was there, obviously, when I was born, and after about 10 days, she went back to Texas, where she was from. And I stayed in the orphanage for about 6 months, and then I was adopted by the folks who raised me, and grew up in that family in New Orleans till I went off to school and, then work and stuff. So, but really, when people say, where are you from? I always say New Orleans.
So she was with you for 10 days. So did you have the experience then of having her in your life for those 10 days?
I guess I did. I don't really remember that very well.
Yeah, well, of course.
Although I do have a memory of the orphanage,
Wow.
which I can tell you about later if you're interested. But I later tracked down my birth mother, and unfortunately she had died by the time I tracked her down. But I met her mother, my grandmother, her 4 sisters, and 2 half
whole
brothers,
family.
whole bunch of cousins, all of whom live in Texas. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
No, yeah, I was just going to say what were the circumstances then that she came to be at the Catholic orphanage from Texas and
Sure.
trekked there?
Yes. Yeah. How did that all happen? Well,
Yes.
my mom, I now have tracked down my birth father also, so I now know the whole story. But that just happened. I tracked down my birth mother, about 30 years ago, and just this year I tracked down my birth father. So they were both working in West Texas, in Midland, Odessa, Texas, in 1949. Or early 1950. And he was a petroleum engineer, and she was working for an oil company. They were hanging out together. And I think the story I heard was that she was trying to break off the relationship and found that she was pregnant and did not tell him. Now, my mother was not raised Catholic, but she had converted to Catholicism during World War II because she was in love with a guy who was Catholic. He unfortunately died in the war. He was a pilot and got shot down and died in the war, but she stayed Catholic. So when she found she was pregnant, she did not tell her family, but she went to tell her priest, her parish priest. And he said, no problem. Here's where you go. Go to this Catholic home for unwed mothers and an orphanage in New Orleans, St. Vincent's home. And that's what she did. Now, in 1950, 2% of white births were out of wedlock births. So this was kind of not a common event.
Yeah.
And so she took that advice and went there, had me, and then went back to Texas. And I think my birth father, never knew about me, as far as I know.
Wow.
I have the same situation. My birth father didn't know about me.
Yeah.
So backtracking, did you, because this is fascinating. Did you know you were adopted always? Like, did your adopted parents?
No, actually, I'm a psychologist, so
right.
I'm a developmental psychologist. So I've studied, how you're supposed to do this. My parents did it totally wrong. I had a sister who was also adopted. She was 4 years older than I was. And she often sort of struggled with my mom. And so one day they were kind of grousing at each other, and my mom was taking her to a birthday party for a friend. And my mom, as she dropped her off, said, "Oh yeah, well, you were adopted, and so was your brother." And so,
Oh,
so this, at that point, my sister was either 10 or 11. So she spent the whole birthday party in tears, and then came home and she was still kind of crying. I said, "What's wrong with you?" And she said, "Well, I'm adopted, and so are you." So that's how I found out I was adopted, and which is, by the way, not the way you're supposed to do it.
no.
No.
Clearly.
And that, gave a lot of messages about, well, you're not supposed to talk about this, or
Right.
this is a secret you're not supposed to tell people about, and stuff like that. So
Did you
that's how I found out.
did you confront your parents in that moment? I mean, you were what,
Seven,
Six.
six or
7?
seven, yeah.
So what did you do with that information?
I don't remember confronting them. I probably asked them, "What's the story?" I was fortunate that I grew up with an aunt and uncle who lived first 5 years of life. We shared a duplex. They were downstairs, we were upstairs. And then they lived, 10 minutes away. So I saw them a lot. They were like grandparents. And I'm sure I talked to my aunt about it more than I talked to my mom and dad about it.
Were you not close to them, your parents?
I was, well, it's complicated. My mom was mentally ill. So, and she was 50 when she adopted me, but she lied about her age to the adoption agency and to my dad. So, not a good basis for a relationship.
Right.
Wow.
But so I, I was pretty close to my dad, and over the years, we talked about adoption, and I had a sort of a summary of my adoption file that he gave me, and that sort of stuff. So I knew I'd been adopted from the orphanage. I knew, I think I knew that they were from Texas. At least my mom was from Texas. And I knew that the orphanage had a file on me.
Now, this is, we talk a lot about the different things that you may have felt in childhood being adopted and not even maybe knowing that you're feeling them or that kind of thing. Did you and your sister have any of those kinds of like, oh, aha, we are adopted, like moments? And how'd your sister do with that? Like,
Well, we had different experiences.
Mhm.
My sister's experience of adoption was very different because she had been in and out of the orphanage. She was finally adopted at age 3.5. But before that, she had been in and out of the orphanage with her birth parents and grandparents, and it was a kind of chaotic family system. So I didn't have any of that, and I think she remembered some of that.
Wow. That's what,
So did that give her sort of a difficult path in life in general?
Yeah, I think life dealt her a tough hand, and she didn't play it well. So there were times when it was hard for her. I think
Yeah.
a lot harder than for me.
But still, you had 6 months of being you touched on having a memory about the orphanage. So I definitely want to hear that.
Yeah.
Well, several years ago, I was getting ready to go back down to New Orleans. I go to New Orleans any chance I get, and I was going to
Love that place.
a high school reunion, and I had made an appointment to go to the orphanage and talk to the social worker to see what I could find out about my file. This was before I had tracked my mother down, and I rarely remember my dreams, but when I woke up one morning before I was going down to New Orleans, I had this image of a room full of cribs from a crib's eye view.
Wow.
And I said, okay, I know what I'm working on. Okay, yeah, okay, great, got it. Day residue, adoption, got it. Okay. So then I went down to New Orleans and I went to the orphanage, and the receptionist said, "Oh, the social worker will be with you in a few minutes. Go sit in the waiting room, and she'll come get you." And this is an orphanage that was started in the 19th century, so there were paintings of Sister that and Father this, and then eventually there were photographs of the nuns and the priests, and then there was a photograph of a room full of cribs, exactly like the image in my dream.
That
And
gives me the chills.
I don't remember. As far as I know, I was never back at that orphanage until I started this, search for my mother. Like growing up in New Orleans, I never went to that orphanage, even though I could have. It was right, it's pretty accessible in the city. But anyway, I think now that's my earliest memory, is that room full of cribs from a crib's eye view.
That's
That's
actually
really incredible.
that's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
And did you, when you went back to the orphanage, did you feel any sort of like nostalgia for like when you first got to your family? Do you remember any of that transition or nothing? I mean, you were very young, so I guess
I
not.
was 6 months old.
Yeah.
I don't remember it.
No.
Uh, a buddy of mine who's a writer, guy named Mark Singer, who's a writer for the New Yorker. He's one of my college roommates. Anyway, Mark said, well, you have to write a book, and the book has to start with you staying at the orphanage, which at that time was a Christian bed and breakfast. I think it was also a brothel because somebody was asking about hourly rates when I was checking out. But at any rate, it's a New Orleans kind of thing, you know.
Yeah.
So I went back and stayed at the orphanage for a couple of nights, and that was kind of interesting.
How did that feel? Did you have any kind of emotional reaction to it, or was it just?
Well, it felt strangely familiar. Parts of it felt strangely familiar. Some of the images, like this is a great old brick building built in the 19th century, huge building, and there was a slide that went from the second story down to the first story. That was the fire escape if you were up on the second floor. And for some reason, that slide seemed familiar to me when I checked in. I said, oh, that seems familiar. But other than that, it was just it was a little strange, you know.
I have so many.
It's now, by the way, been redone as a boutique hotel and bar. I haven't been back. It's been redone, yeah.
I have a lot of questions, but I keep focusing back on so that your parents didn't adopt you until your mother was 50 and your father did not know she was 50. What were these circumstances that they came to adopt you?
Well, my mother couldn't have kids and wanted kids, and they'd already adopted one. They adopted my sister. They adopted a daughter. And so, you know, American dream, have one of each. Right? So
was this a second marriage or something? I mean, it especially for 1950, it seems like that's.
Well, they got married in World War II. He looked really good in his Navy whites, and he was a pilot, and she lived in Jacksonville, Florida, where he was doing training. And they got married in the war, and then she moved to New Orleans, where her brother and his wife, my aunt and uncle, lived. And so after the war, they settled in New Orleans.
And she just lied about her age at that time, probably for dating and.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
People still do that.
You know, right.
The World War II version of Bumble.
Right. Love does strange things, you know. And it's funny, I have some letters that my dad sent to my mom during the war. He was in the Navy, he was a Navy pilot, and he was in Alaska and the Pacific Theater. And, you know, they're really, you know, sweet, romantic letters, and, you know, so.
And did you pursue, I mean, you may not know this or have you thought about it, but did you pursue your career? You can tell us what you do. And because of anything with your adoption or figuring yourself out or?
Well, I don't think it was so much about adoption. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, clinical and developmental psychology. I did specialize in aging and mental health. And I
saw that.
I don't think that was random. I think, you know, I was trying to figure out mentally ill elderly most of my life when growing up, because my mom fit into that category.
I saw that on LinkedIn. I'm like, that's it.
Yeah. So I don't think that was random.
Yeah.
But it also happened to be, when I got into that field, it was a pretty young field, clinical psych and aging. There weren't a lot of people doing that combination. And I realized, this was in the early 1970s, I realized, aging's not going away in my lifetime. So this is a pretty good area to be working in, not just to try to figure out my mom, but, you know, there were a lot of interesting and important issues to focus on.
Oh, yeah.
Is your mom still alive?
No, she died in the early 1990s.
And your dad?
Yeah, he died. He predeceased her. He died in 1985.
So you at 6 get told by your sister, and then is there do what how did you next then deal with
And
your
then here we
adoption?
are. And then here we
Yeah,
are.
right. But so I mean there's a big chunk of time from when you went and found your birth mother. How did that play out, and what was your childhood like beyond that? Like again, we did talk about having those familiar, the connection that adopted people seem to have is just always feeling like something is amiss or a little
Right.
bit different, not fitting in, kind of.
Well, I mean, um, in my case, I think it was an advantage because I had a mentally ill mother, and I could always say, "Well, not my gene pool," you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was part of the way I kind of dealt with that dysfunction. Um, I didn't tell my friends about being adopted, and I really didn't talk about it um, publicly until senior year in college. Really,
Wow.
I was in a group and we were doing autobiographies, and so for me the big decision was, do I talk about adoption or not? That was like the critical issue. Do I tell this group of 15 people about adoption?
We
Uh,
had another guest who touched on that. He is around your age, around your age and birth time. And he said, it wasn't, even when Sarah and I were raised, you didn't really just go out there and say you were adopted. I mean, because there might be
right.
something wrong with you. Are you adopted? It's kind of, it was a little bit looked down on.
Yeah.
And so that's just
Right.
fascinating that you brought that up.
Well, yeah. But so for me, I think that was a big issue trying to decide, to whom do I disclose that and that sort of stuff. Um, yeah.
And your family, your extended family must have known you were adopted, and your sister.
Yes. Yeah. My aunt, uncle, and, the
Mm-hmm.
whole family on both sides knew. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And did anybody ever discuss it with you guys or talk to you about it? Or was it just kind of a moot point in your house?
Well, it's kind of a moot point. I think my aunt and uncle, whom I lived next door to, especially my aunt, I spent a lot of time with my aunt in my first 4 or 5 years because she was just downstairs. And I think she was a source of unconditional positive regard. So she would talk about being adopted, but it was no big deal. And,
Yeah. Made it normal.
we wanted you and,
Yeah.
that sort of stuff.
And then at what point, so was it after your senior year in college, when did you decide to start seeking out your biological parents?
I started looking when I was around 40. Maybe it was midlife rumination. I don't know. But I think by that point, my dad had died and my mother was in a nursing home. She had dementia later in life. And so in some ways I didn't feel like, I mean, my dad and I talked about it. So I would not have felt I was betraying him by going to look or searching. But for some reason, I just didn't start looking until really around age 40. And
I think
then
that's actually kind of normal when we found a lot of people really
yeah,
start around 40
I
and
think,
50.
I think people look when they're ready for various
Mm-hmm.
reasons. And I've had friends who've adopted, and they've talked to me about, how do you talk to your kid about it, but also when will my kid look? And I always say when they're ready.
Yeah.
And you can't really, I don't think you can predict that. Some of them may look earlier, but for me, it was around age 40. And I have a buddy who's a lawyer, and he was telling me about a case he had of a bigamist living with a third wife and, hiding out. And he used a private eye to track him down. And I said, "Yeah, I wonder if that private eye could track down my mother." And he said, "I don't know. Let's find out." So I contacted this private eye in Seattle, Washington. And how long do you think it took him to find my mother? So this is like 40 years after she had given me up for
A
adoption.
day, 2 days.
2 working days.
Yeah.
That's
2 working
and
days.
that obviously pre-DNA testing and
Oh yeah, this was before 23andMe and all that. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and he said this was the part I did not find plausible. He said, "Well, a friend of his worked in the orphanage." I think really what happened was I paid for him to have a great weekend in New Orleans,
Yes.
and he bribed somebody to read my record. because in the adoption file, my mom used her real name
Oh,
and her place of birth or where she was from, and it was a small farm town in the middle of Texas. So once he had that, he called the postmistress, talked to her. She knew everybody. She knew the whole family. She knew where my mother, unfortunately, had died by that point, but he knew where my mother. She knew where my mother was buried. Knew where my aunts lived. You know, knew the whole family. So it was really a piece of cake for him once the friend of a friend of his helped
Friend
him
of a
out.
friend.
Yeah,
How old was she when she gave birth to you?
she was 28.
Oh,
Oh.
so not young.
No, she had worked. She had been a stewardess, and then she her I think her mom said, "Oh, that's too dangerous. Why don't you like go work in West Texas?" And her sister and brother-in-law were working in West Texas at the time, so she was out, living with them and working for the oil company.
And that's her using her real name. You wonder if she wanted to be found one day and meet you. And that's sad that it.
Well, she only used her real name on one form,
Oh, okay.
and the rest she used an alias. So she used the alias Charlotte Upton, and my original
That's
name
a
was
good one.
Charles Upton. I could have been Chuck Upton,
Uh,
but fortunately, I got adopted.
I could have been Donna Lynn Dick.
yeah.
There you go.
We have a lot of we've discussed our names.
Yeah,
How did she die?
she died of a heart attack. She had a massive heart attack. She she smoked and had high cholesterol that went untreated, and high triglycerides. And so when I tracked her down, and there's a whole story about making contact with the family, because I can tell you that story too.
Yes.
But once I tracked her down and connected with the family, one of my cousins is a physician, and she reached out to me and said, "Here's a family medical history that you
Oh,
might want to know about." So that was really nice.
That's
is nice.
helpful.
Yeah,
It
it was
is
great.
so helpful. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think Sarah originally one of the comments that she read when you were on the New York Times part was that you were annoyed that you couldn't find there's not records for
Well,
adoption.
yeah.
For knowing yourself.
At that time, and I think it's still the case that as an adoptee, I cannot gain access to my original birth certificate.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know. So when I get a birth certificate from Louisiana now, for whatever reason, it shows up with my adoptive parents' names on it.
Yeah, mine too.
Yeah. So, and I don't know, even if I could unseal my original birth certificate, I'm not sure if my father's name would have been on there. I don't know. But as it turns out, I tracked him down in another way.
So, okay. So tell us about the tracking down your mom and then your dad. I mean, we
Yeah.
definitely want to hear
Okay,
it.
so my mom, so the private eye made it easy, right?
Yeah.
He
That's
found her.
crazy.
But then there began this mystery about my grandmother was in kind of poor health, mentally very sharp, but physically very frail, kind of frail. She was in her 90s. So then it was like, who can know this secret in the family?
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out that when my mother was having me over in New Orleans, the same grandmother was in the hospital at that time, 40 years earlier, and they thought she was going to die. And so her brother, my mother's brother-in-law, was a Mason in Waco, Texas. And the sheriff of Waco was one of his Mason brothers in the Masonic temple.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the sheriff said, "Oh, I'll find Claire. I can track her down." And sure enough, he did. So that brother-in-law, George, called Claire and said, "Your mom's ill. Call us tonight." Went home, said to his wife, "Found Claire. She's fine. She's going to call tonight. And I can't tell you anything more because it's a Mason secret." And his wife said, "Okay, that's the part I find kind of hard to believe, but
Yeah.
okay."
Yeah.
But fast forward many years later, and he's dying of COPD and emphysema. And so he calls in his daughter. Now, this is like my generation now. Calls in his daughter and says, "Just remember, Claire went to New Orleans in 1950. And he calls in his son, who at that time was about 18 or 19, and says, somebody in your generation needs to know Claire had a son in New Orleans in 1950. He then dies. Several years later, I contact their mother, who is the oldest living sibling of my birth mother. You following this? I know it's
Yep.
Yes, yes, I
Yep,
do.
yep.
Yeah.
a lot of moving parts here.
Yeah.
So I contact the oldest living sibling, and she says, no, I don't think so, because, my sister would have told me
Oh.
about this, and I never heard anything about this. So she gets off the phone with me, and I said, well, let me send you some pictures. Maybe I look like people. So she gets off the phone with me, calls her daughter, and her daughter says, well, Claire went to New Orleans in 1950. Okay. So then she calls her son, and her son says, well, Claire had a son in New Orleans in 1950. And she goes, ah. And then I sent pictures, and I look like people. As they say in Texas, I do favor them. So,
Yeah.
so then once I did that, then the family secret was like, okay, who gets to know, and is grandmother strong enough to
Handle
hear
it.
this news? And so then they decided to tell her, and then they decided to have a family reunion to meet me, to hear the guy who talks so funny, because I don't sound like anybody from Texas. And so my wife and I went down, and my grandmother brought out the family Bible and showed me that she'd written my name in it, as her way of saying, you're one of us.
Oh, she
Yeah.
added your name to it.
Yeah.
That's not,
Which was really sweet.
it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Did you feel any sort of familiarity with them?
Well, there are a lot of short people who look a lot like me. Yeah, I think it was funny, Sarah. It was more, in a way, more emotional for them,
Yeah.
because
Yes.
my mother had died 12 years earlier, and I evidently have mannerisms like her. I sound like her. And so for them, it was like seeing her again in a
Yes.
different way. So that was pretty emotional for them.
I had the same experience as you. Same
Did you?
exact. I met my biological family after my biological mom died when she was 27. And
Oh,
so I met them when I was 32, but I look like her. I sound like her. And people would visibly break down
right,
talking to me and have to leave the room.
right. Yeah,
And
and you're thinking, what did I do?
yeah,
Right.
when I was first greeted, they opened the door and left sobbing. No one can really speak to me comfortably. The younger generation can, but I have a lot of reactions from that. And it's a strange thing to feel, because you think I'm just me.
Yeah, right.
But then you realize, gosh,
Yeah, and Louise, how old were you when you were adopted?
I was a baby. I was a few days old.
So you don't
Several
have any
days.
memory
No,
of that, your mom's looks and mannerisms and
no,
all that. Yeah, yeah,
no.
yeah. So that's what happened for me. I mean, the folks in Texas have been very welcoming. That first meeting was a little strange because they were much more emotional than I was,
Yeah.
but it
That
was,
seems to be a
Yeah. Sarah
recurring
had that.
theme
We both
too.
had that.
I had the same thing when I met my.
yeah, yeah. So, and I have two half brothers, and
Are you in touch with them and
I
have
am.
relationships? And
Yeah, I am, and then I have a bunch of cousins. Uh, almost all the cousins live in Texas, and at the time when I met them, all of them except one lived in Texas, and that one lived in Louisiana, so they didn't get
Oh.
very. And when I
Texas,
asked
don't
them,
leave Texas.
well, that's what I said. Why are you all in Texas? And they said, well, Texas is as big as France.
Yeah.
they don't leave Texas. I know. I have a lot of Texan friends.
Yeah, so it's really clear, if I had grown up with my mom's family, I'd be living in Texas, and yeah, which would be good.
So then I'm gonna guess that you found your dad through like Ancestry or 23andMe, and
Yeah, what happened? I have a cousin by adoption. My cousin from the dad who raised me, his family. And she, when she retired, she decided her hobby would be finding my father.
Oh, for you.
And so I said, okay. And so she said, the way we're going to do it is through genetic databases. This is just when things were getting started,
Just
FTD
taking off.
and, GEDmatch and 23andMe, Ancestry. So I put my stuff out there, and I kind of had low expectations. I thought it was, a low probability event. But about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, maybe now, I got an email from 23andMe saying you have a first cousin. And that's the closest match I'd ever had. That was
Yeah.
really close. And I thought, whoa. And so I emailed the person on 23andMe platform, nothing, radio silence. And, every now and then you get this message from 23andMe, oh yeah, you have, she's been on there. You have this first cousin. She's been active like a month ago or whatever. Radio silence. And then I have a friend who's a retired first grade teacher who always wanted to be a private eye, except she has ADD, so she's not real good on stakeouts. But anyway, she was we spent Christmas and New Year's with her and her husband. And I said, 6 months, I got nothing from this first cousin. She said, give me that. She went from 23andMe to Ancestry to Facebook, to others, social media, quickly put it together. This is not your first cousin. This is your niece.
Oh.
And her mother is your half sister, and her grandfather is your father. And so it all started to make sense when we looked at it that way. And so then began a process which I was by now familiar with, because 30 years before I had done it with my mother. I had the same lawyer friend of mine write a letter, this time to my father's family, saying, I have a client who has reason to believe he's not looking for money. It's not a scam. And we put enough information in the letter that they could Google me. They could Google him and his law firm. They could Google a bunch of stuff. The orphanage, so they could see it was legit and now a boutique hotel. And so we sent off a letter. Unfortunately, we sent it right when, remember this year, Texas had a big freeze and the power went out and the grid went down.
Yeah.
I sent a letter via FedEx that took 10 days to get to Texas. But eventually it got there, and when you send a FedEx letter, they send you a text saying your letter has been delivered. So on a Friday afternoon, I got this text saying your letter has been delivered to at least one of the 3 half siblings. And I thought, okay, it's probably going to take them a couple of weeks to kind of process this among themselves. And because they've never heard of me, their dad didn't know about me. So there's no way they knew about me either.
It's like cold call.
Totally cold call. So within an hour, I get a text from this guy, from my half brother, Toby, saying, we need to talk. So we arranged to talk. We talked the next day. And in this case, I was thinking, okay, I'm ready. I'm going to make the sale. I'm going to convince him that here's why I think it's true, and all that sort of stuff. So we get on the phone and he says, I have a whole bunch of family history and stuff I'd like to share with you. So I'll send you. It's like he need to be sold. And the reason that happened was I have a website. I do climate change work, trying to move people from anxiety to action on climate issues. So I have a website called Growing Greener, growing-greener.org. And on that website, there are pictures of me doing workshops. In fact, the last big workshop I did before the pandemic shut things down was at Duke. And I'm in this room full of 80 people. It's beautiful lighting. It's a beautiful room. It's a great evening. And I'm just doing my thing, doing the workshop. And he said, well, I looked at your website and, except you look exactly like our dad, except your hair's too long.
Oh my goodness.
And he
had no doubt.
And he showed the picture to his wife, and she said, you don't need genetic tests.
There's dad.
Yeah, that's the guy. Yeah, absolutely. He's your father's son. So then I talked to the other 2 half siblings, and they were also very welcoming and nice. I haven't gone down and met them yet. In part, the pandemic has made this kind of difficult. But I'm hoping to meet at least the older one, who's now in Michigan, this fall. We have plans to do that unless the variants and things change our plans.
Yeah. Is your father still alive?
No, unfortunately, he died 20 years ago. Yeah.
Oh, one quick question, because it stuck. Why didn't the niece answer your 23andMe messages?
I don't know. I'm going to have to find that out.
Yes.
I think
rude millennial.
Well, no, I think, hey, first of all, she's busy, B, who is this guy stalking her, right?
Yeah.
I mean, really. And
That's funny.
especially since nobody in the family knew about me. So like, who is this guy? And
Yeah.
I have the same going on my ancestry. There's a cousin,
right.
and because of my son, I figured out who she is and everything in the whole social media world.
Right.
But I've written
Yeah.
a few things. I got one reply, but now that I've written a few more, because
Well,
they're kind of like,
and
oh,
I have heard from that niece once. Like she was sort of brokering,
yes,
making sure her mom got in touch with me. Because she was basically saying, yeah, this story's legit. He really did show up on 23andMe. It's not bogus. But it would be fun to meet them. Mainly, I think, to hear stories about my dad and just what kind of guy he was and
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
So clearly he stayed in Texas. So you both you're biologically from Texas.
If I had grown up in either of these families, I would have strong Texas roots. Yeah.
What
guys
part
still
of
be in
Texas?
Well, they live in Fort Worth.
Okay,
Yeah.
my son lives in Dallas
Okay, there you go. Yeah.
and lives with his Dallas girlfriend. I'm like,
And
you ever
he'd be
gonna leave
never leave
Texas? Yeah.
Yeah, right. Well, Texas is as big as France. Yeah.
Yep.
I have a cousin on my mother's side who lives in Dallas. I also have a cousin, we have a cousin in Austin and Midland, Odessa, say 2 half brothers in San Antonio. They're all over. Yeah.
And are you going to write a book? You mentioned the book part. Is that something you're thinking about, or was that more?
I don't know. I don't know. I kind of doubt it, but I might. Whenever I tell my story, people are kind of interested because it is, first of all, New Orleans is kind of an interesting place to grow up.
Mm-hmm. I love New Orleans.
Yeah, it's a great town.
It is.
And it has its challenges, but I'm in love with New Orleans. I have a love affair.
Love that.
It's just I can't be objective about the city. But I don't know. I mean, right now I'm really focused on climate change because
Yeah.
I think that's a much bigger deal than my life.
And we love that. We love the work you're doing. Both
Okay.
Sarah and I were like, wish we could have a podcast about that next.
Yeah, anytime. Climate change is it's real and it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I like how you're taking it from anxiety to acceptance.
Action.
Yes, action,
Yeah.
and not.
Yeah, I'm using psychology and design strategies to help people break the climate silence habit.
Yeah.
Most of us know something's going on, but we don't know what to do about it. So over 70% of Americans say, yeah, climate change is real, but only about a third ever talk about it with family members and friends. And so we found a way to help people talk about it and then take the next step and take some action.
That's neat.
So you do these workshops?
Yeah, we do workshops and we develop materials for organizations. And since the pandemic, all of our materials are online, so we can kind of custom design materials. For example, we've done some work. We're working now with a university in the Netherlands, and we've designed, we basically have a climate deck, a deck of climate action cards. Mm-hmm. And so we designed a deck for this Dutch university that they're going to use with their first year student orientation to get their incoming students to be thinking about sustainability right off the bat as they enter school.
That's wonderful.
And we're working with the university in Austria and Ireland and an elementary school in Shreveport, Louisiana, and a bunch of places,
That's good work.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very good work. I'd love to actually sit in on it. I mean, do you have virtual workshops and?
Yeah. Well, drop me a note. I'll tell you when we're doing something.
I would love that. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, and the other thing we do is we train people in how to use these materials with their groups because it's really easy and it's fun. What happens is people really enjoy it. Particularly, we have an elementary school deck of climate action cards, and kids love it. Kids have a great time with it. And I know it works because grandparents steal the decks. Which is
I was just thinking I want a deck.
I know, me too.
That's a market test. Well, go to growing-greener.org and you can buy decks right there.
I will do that. And good gifts to give to people too, like as a way of starting a conversation.
Yeah,
right, exactly.
Yeah.
Good holiday stocking stuffers.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to do that. And you have kids?
Yeah, we have 2 kids, a son and a daughter. And we have 4 grandkids, 4 grandsons, twin 5-year-olds, a 3-year-old, and a 2-year-old.
Mm.
Yeah.
Sounds like you have a really good, busy, full life.
Yes, I'm very fortunate. Yeah, I do.
And
Yep.
it's nice that you can actually share with them too your biological side as
Yeah.
well for genealogy and all that. I mean, to me, that's an interesting part of it all for myself. So
Yeah, absolutely. And also, like, when our daughter was a teenager, she sometimes say, I was adopted. And I say, no, you can't use that one on me.
yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, right. Play another card. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
At least, even if like we talk about, even if you had the most, perfect adoption scenario, which obviously you didn't, but just having that answer of looking like somebody in the world, finally seeing
Yeah.
people that you look like. And
when I reached out to my father's family and they sent me pictures, I get it. I mean, yeah, I see where that look comes from. Yeah. Curly hair, mustache. Got it. Yep. Okay.
yeah.
And my aunts on my mother's side, when I'd say, well, can you remember anything? And I say, yeah, what was that guy's name? Short guy, curly hair. What was his name? So now I know, but anyway, yeah.
That's great.
Well,
Well,
I've been very lucky.
Thank
This
you
is-
so much for
yeah.
sharing with us and coming on today. We know you oops, my dog is leaving the closet.
This has been really enjoyable, actually. It's your story is so intricate. It's, at first I was thinking, where is this going? And then I'm like, wow, you really have an intricate story. I mean, I do think you could write a book.
Well,
that's your
thanks.
next phase.
Yeah. Well, I won't rule it out. Yeah. But in the meantime, thanks for having me, Louise and Sarah. I've enjoyed it.
You're
Okay,
so welcome.
We'll
Thank
follow
you.
up with you after.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you.
Thank you, Mick.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.